This is joint work with, how long do I have? 35 minutes, okay. This is joint work with my long-run collaborator, Anders Björklund. Some in the audience have heard him give this talk before. It's very much a conceptual piece about different ways of looking at intergenerational income mobility. I should add, I'll have more to say about this. And Anders and I have, together and in part separately, worked on income mobility since the early 1990s. And every now and again we've tried to take a step back and in our, not terribly deep, but all the same, in our way, try to understand better different aspects of mobility. One of the things we did quite some while ago was to try to understand differences in income mobility and occupational or social mobility more clearly. And this was an endeavor which in fact made us many friends among sociologists and it was very useful for our own thinking. And now we've been spending a lot of time trying to understand the importance of family background for the distribution of economic resources. And so I'll go, so essentially there are more than just 4 approaches. I'll have more to say on that in a minute, but the 4 ones we're quite familiar with are to look at intergenerational income mobility, or economic mobility. There's a little more to this. Transmission, mostly in fact it's about intergenerational income persistence. That's one, and that's the best known. Then there's a literature that trying to figure out intergenerational effects by which we understand causal impacts of parental characteristics on the outcomes of their children. That's of course an important thing for economists. I'll have more to say about that as well. As you'll probably discover, our favorite way to think about this is in terms of sibling correlations, and the reasons for why that is I'll discuss at greater length. But another approach that we became familiar with some years ago, and in fact have worked with a little bit, is to look at this from the point of view of equality of opportunity in a very structured way, and I think that's quite useful as well. But all of these are different ways of trying to get at the same thing. So what we try to do is that we discuss all of these in turn. We try to look at what questions it is that these approaches are designed to answer and what the results are from looking at this. I'll be looking a little bit of international evidence as we go along, but do several illustrations using Swedish data as well. So why do we do this? Well, first of all, we want to know how important family background is for the inequality of the outcomes that people with an economic background tend to care about. These, in our case, are long-run income and to a lesser extent education. It turns out that the 4 different approaches can give quite different answers. And that was an important motivation for this. One of the reasons for this is that there are different mechanisms at play. So by comparing what you find with these 4 different approaches, you may find that different things are driving, if you will, income stratification. But it's also the case that people who engage in these 4 different literatures tend not to speak to each other very much. And I think a lot can be learned from actually holding conversations. Now, from a public policy perspective, the thing we're trying to understand is family background really, is it a big factor in accounting for inequality, or is it just a kind of minor thing? And I think it's important if we really want to understand how inequality comes about to look at these things at greater length. So the roadmap here is very simple. I'm going to walk through each of the approaches in turn, comment a little bit always backwards, and then say some words in conclusion. Now, these are not the only 4 approaches you might take, even in economics. And the really important omission here from an economist perspective is that we don't discuss structural modeling at all. The kind of work, for instance, which nowadays is very much associated with James Heckman's work on early investments, how this kind of one begets the other, which is highly structural. Discussing that is a world of its own, but we're skipping that. We're also not considering social mobility. We try to be, with which we here understand class and in particular occupation-based class mobility. There's a very, very large literature on that. There's also a very large sociological literature on educational mobility, but we're looking at this as economists, so we won't really be discussing the sociological approaches. I will say that reading those literatures and learning from it has been a tremendous experience. I have an office in Stockholm very close to one of a big name in social mobility, Robert Eriksson, and every day I learn from conversations with him, but I'm going to be sticking here to the economic stuff, and we're looking at long-run income and earnings, and we're looking at years of education, which again is a very crude way to look at education, but for our purposes here is enough. And the third, and possibly the largest defect here in our presentation is that we don't treat the gender dimension. We don't do any justice to the gender dimension. It is in part a reflection on the literature that mobility is very much about the mobility of men. There are reasons for that. It's extremely complicated if you want to take gender seriously. I may have a little more to say on that later on, but this is really about mobility among men. So, now intergenerational mobility is really, it's good that I've been working on this for decades, and it's good. It's a very simple thing. You don't need to learn a lot of new stuff. Francis Galton kind of laid out the statistical machinery in 1818, the late 19th century, and after that the less intelligent among us have been able to stick to his approach, more or less. This is the descriptive association across the outcomes of two, possibly more generations. Now, the main claim here is that the intergenerational associations are not all that strong, and they imply a great deal of mobility. Not necessarily so if you look at the very top, and in particular if you do include capital income, but our claim is this. Now, the Galtonian regression Galton regressed child height on mid-parent, the average of parental height, but essentially Galton estimated a model like this. The regression coefficient beta measures persistence. It's the elasticity when the y's are logarithms. If you modify by the ratio of standard deviations, you get the Pearson correlation coefficient from this. Now, there are lots of variations on this business, but this beta is what very much of the intergenerational income mobility literature is based on. There are tons of variations, as I said. There are additional terms to pick up nonlinearities. Now, following the work of Raj Chetty, it's fashionable to look at rank correlations instead, but you can do this in terms of transition matrices and whatnot. Now, cross-nationally, depending on which version of the Great Gatsby curve we're looking at, the elasticities range from about 0.15 to 0.50. On the correlations, it's likely that there's a little bit of less variation because of differential relative standard deviations, cross-sectional inequalities in the parental and offspring generations, but there's less comparable information on the correlations. Now, the way this works is that we convert this into we convert the elasticity into its importance for inequality by doing a simple but false trick, which is to say that, well, suppose the elasticities are correlations. Essentially, suppose we're observing a steady state, then squaring the elasticity roughly gets you the R squared, the share of variance in the outcome generation, which is accounted for by variation in the parental generation, and these 0.15 to 0.50 translate to roughly 2% to 25% of the variance of the offspring generation long-run income variance. And we think that between 2 and 25% is not a lot as an account of current income inequality. Now, things do look a little different if you make this story richer. So we've taken Swedish data. This is market income. We've taken a 6-year average of both parents and fathers and sons market income, and these are income ranks. So we've divided the population into 2.5 percentile point bins, and then we've essentially cross-tabulated the two and do it as a color map here. So one of the things you can see, so we have a intergenerational elasticity of 0.27. Here the correlation is 0.15, but one of the things you can see is that being in the very top corner here has a much higher probability than being in the rest. So we have a clear excess persistence at the very top. There's a little bit of that at the bottom, but mostly it really is concentration at the top, which is where things are outstanding. Otherwise, again, what you make of this is something of an open issue, but based on the correlation 0.15 squared, we don't have a lot of parental income doesn't account for much of the distribution of sons' income in Sweden here. We've got earnings as well where things look reasonably similar, but the associations are less strong. But I'm going to skip that. On years of schooling, I actually checked Tom Hertz's paper, or Tom Hertz and a large number of co-authors. They don't actually give the results for Israel, unfortunately. I would have added it to this table had there been so, but we're going to hear more about Israeli educational and social mobility later on. So, but by and large, you can do the same kind of Galtonian regression on education. What exactly you get out of this is something of an open issue. For some reason, for instance, both Italy and the UK appear to have very high regression coefficients, but the correlation coefficients are substantially lower. So you have a wider range in this column, which have the regression coefficients, than in this column, which have the Pearson correlation coefficients, reflecting the fact that the marginal distributions move in different ways across countries. But by and large, what is remarkable about these is that these regression coefficients are substantially higher than what we find for income. What you make of that is an open issue. I'll say more about that a little later on. So we think the income associations aren't strong. Education associations are higher, and scatter plots do reveal a lot of mobility. So I'm not going to go into the difference between persistence and mobility, but I think that it's a little simplistic to just think that 1 minus the Galtonian beta is equal to mobility, because there are variations to that story which I think could be crashed out and threshed out in greater detail. Now, intergenerational effects. Now, what these try to look at is what's the causal effect of a particular intervention to change parents' income or education on the outcome of the children. Now, this is potentially quite different from the descriptive intergenerational mobility pattern. The main claim we make based on this literature is the intergenerational effects are clearly smaller than the intergenerational mobility or persistence estimates would reveal. So much of the intergenerational persistence estimates is based on unobserved characteristics of the parents rather than their observed characteristics. So the prototypical model takes often both the father's and the mother's characteristics, say their education levels or their income levels, and then regresses offspring income on that, but uses some kind of empirical strategy to get at a causal effect. a couple of decades ago, it was very popular to try to find twin parents, preferably monozygotic twins, and look at the outcomes of their respective children. So we're looking at the difference in the outcome for the twin parents and we regress the outcome of their children. That is the difference in the cousins' outcomes on the parents. The idea here is that by taking the difference in the twin parents, you're getting rid of both genetic effects and shared environment of the twins. Another popular approach is to use adoptive parents, which eliminates, at least in principle, it eliminates genetic transmission if adoptive children are randomly assigned to the adoptive parents. And the third, possibly most convincing, depending of course exactly on the details, is to use an instrumental variable strategy, to use some kind of reform or other fluke of nature that modified the parental characteristics in ways which can be reasonably argued to be exogenous. So comprehensive school reform is one example that had been used if parents were affected by that. There are examples from the US of casinos being built on Native American reservations and such things which modify the characteristics of the parents. The estimates of these causal effects in general are lower, sometimes a lot lower than the intergenerational associations themselves. They range from about 0 to 60% of the intergenerational effects. There are examples where the causal effects can be very large. We probably think there of people who are really in the corner of the distribution of parental resources, for instance, and you raise their levels, then this might have a big impact. But in general, the causal effects are very, very small. Now, sibling associations. Anders and I have spent many years trying to push this view, of course, which we've adopted largely from Gary Solon in the US, but our impact hasn't been huge until now. Now, the way this works is the following. So we take an outcome, education or income, and we think of it as consisting of two different components. A family component in AI here, and then an individual deviation of an individual's outcome from that family component. Because we're mostly dealing with cases where you only observe a person growing up in a single family. These are orthogonal by construction, so the B is measured as a deviation from the A, essentially. Because they're orthogonal, the population variance in the outcome of interest is the sum of two variance components, the variance of the family component and the variance of the individual component. Now, so the answer to the question, how important is the family in accounting for the variance of the whole outcome? We can think of the R squared of family background as being the ratio of the variance of the family component to the overall variance. So that's the part of the overall variance that we can assign to family background. So it's a descriptive measure. We tend to call this a sibling correlation because it coincides under this very simple model. It's the same number you'd get if you'd randomly draw pairs of siblings from the population and measure their Pearson correlation coefficient. But we think of it as the R squared of family background. Now, one of the reasons we like this a lot is that under this very simple model, it's kind of trivial to show, but you need a little bit of additional assumptions. But essentially, the sibling correlation is the intergenerational correlation squared plus a residual. And this residual captures the stuff that siblings share, which are orthogonal to parental income. So suppose, for instance, that that there are two types of parents, regardless of income level. Some who read a lot to their children, help them with their homework at evenings, and those who don't. If reading at night and getting help with your homework gives you a higher income or a higher education level, that's going to show up as a large other shared factors element in this, because it operates regardless of the level of income that the parents have. So of course some of this is things other than what that parents do that affect you, part of which is captured in the intergenerational correlation and part is not. So for instance, if the neighborhood you live in affects very much the kind of school you end up in and so on, it's also other things than the family. So we tend to think of this as family background and neighborhood factors. But it's also a lower bound on the impact of family, because anything that siblings don't share is not captured by this. So suppose, for instance, that boys and girls are treated very differently within families. Then, of course, this way of looking at sibling correlation is going to capture only that part of the treatment or the outcomes of the children which they do share, and not the differential treatment. Or suppose you have a very strong primogenitor culture where a lot is invested in the firstborn children and not as much in the older one. Then again, we won't be capturing this in the sibling correlation. Now, estimates of the sibling correlations, there are far fewer of these. I was wondering why this thing didn't work, but it's because the USB isn't in. So now, so we have a number of estimates, far fewer than we'd like to have. The US leads the pack here. Bash Mazumdar has provided us with a wealth of information on these things, but in the US this row is about 0.49 in long-run annual earnings. That means that 1/2 of the variance of long-run earnings among US men is accounted for by their family background. By contrast, we tend to think that physical characteristics are strongly inherited. And Bash, in the same paper, he provides a comparison between the sibling brother correlation in economic characteristics such as hourly wages and annual earnings, and physical characteristics such as body mass index, for instance. The brother correlation in body mass index is exactly the same number, 0.49, whereas the brother correlation in hourly wages is 0.51. So we think that physical characteristics have a very high correlation, but in fact it's on the same order of magnitude as the economic characteristics. The Nordic countries, the Norwegian number of 0.14 I've always viewed with a little bit of suspicion, even if it's in a paper on which I'm a co-author, but who knows. Denmark has 0.2. Sweden, this particular estimate for Sweden it's on the high end, and in fact it's a little hard to compare with the others for technical reasons, but it's about 0.32, and Finland has about 1/4 of the long-run inequality as measured by the variance of long-run income accounted for by family background. China is at the high end here at 0.57. We don't have a lot of these from middle-income countries, but we tend to find higher persistence in those when we do have the numbers. Brother correlations in income we have mainly for men. In years of schooling we have less of a focus on only men. In Germany, for instance, brothers have a correlation of about 2/3. In years of education, sisters have a slightly lower one at about 0.55. Daniel Schnitzlein didn't do the kind of all children, so we don't know. But in Norway, we know that mixed sexes have about 2/5 of the variance is accounted for by family background, and the same number is approximately true for brothers and sisters in the US. In Sweden, whereas in the US, about 3/5 of the variance is accounted for by family background in years of schooling. So these tend to be higher than the numbers we get for earnings. Now, we think even if these are high numbers, so we think that say in Sweden 1/3 of the variance is accounted for by family background, that's kind of getting somewhere already. That's substantially higher than the about 3 to 4% we get on parental income. But these are still only lower bounds. So one of the things you can do is try to look at genetic factors. This always crops up in conversations about these things. Another thing is that not all environmental experiences and shocks are shared. So we're missing some important environmental things, but which children don't share, and we also miss differential treatment. Now, one of the things that in fact there's a huge literature on this from earlier times is to look at twins, and in particular monozygotic twins. They share all their initial genes, which is good, so that kind of controls for genetic influences. They also share more environment than other siblings, both fraternal twins and other general siblings. That's also good. But on the other hand, monozygotic twins may interact, and in fact they interact and affect each other more than members of the general population might, and that's kind of a bad thing. And because of this third factor here, the monozygotic correlation might be an upper bound on family background rather than a kind of higher lower bound. But when we try to do this in Sweden, we do in fact get that a substantially higher fraction of the outcomes is accounted for by family background. So we get, on both earnings and on years of education, we get about 3/4 of the variance accounted for by family background, which is substantially higher than the number for full siblings. But again, it still leaves 1/4 of the variance to unshared, non-shared environments. And this is probably, we think, an upper bound. Birth order is a candidate, but I'm not going to say much more about that right now. What I will say a little more about is the fact that we can decompose the sibling correlation into that part which is due to the correlation between parents and offspring, and these other shared factors, because they turn out to be very large. So take the brother correlation in the earnings. Again, for complicated reasons, this is not the 32, so this is 1/4 in Sweden in this particular study is accounted for by family background. That's the column of rows. If we take the parent-child correlation and square it, it's 2%. Okay, that's the R² that we assign to parents. That means that these other factors, the reading at night, the helping with homework, the playing in the yard with your siblings, that's the vast majority of the importance of family background is something else than parental income. It's at least something that's orthogonal to it. The difference is less stark when we look at schooling, but even there, for Swedish men, twice as much of the overall importance of family background is from these other shared factors rather than the parent-child correlation. And this is one of the reasons we think that the sibling correlations really are very important, because they reveal a huge influence that is not captured by the intergenerational links. So I'm not going to say much more. I will make this point, however. So this is from a paper by Anders and Matthew Lindquist and myself from a few years back. This line here is the brother correlation in years of education for cohorts born starting in 1932, and the final cohort is born in the late 1960s. And you see that the share of family background in years of schooling is more or less constant across much of the 20th century, whereas this is the brother correlation in earnings, which you see declines quite steeply, notches up a little bit, but still lands at a point much lower than where it started from. So these things can move in different directions, and of course divergence between them are interesting in themselves. We don't quite know why this is, but all the same, my point is that they're not necessarily substitutes for each other, but may reveal quite different patterns going on. So I need to move on more quickly in order to make it to the end. Now, the equality of opportunity approach which we're not doing a lot of justice to it here. It's very strongly philosophically grounded in several papers, including the work by John Romer, which I'm mainly relying on here. And you can think of it as, so the idea is essentially this, that there are two kinds of inequality. The kind of inequality that's due to a set of circumstances over which individuals have no control, such as their family background and so on. And then within any set of circumstances, people do differently well because they exert differential amounts of effort. And the idea here is to try to separate between that part of inequality which is driven by differences in circumstances from that which is driven by differences in effort. Raises a large number of difficult questions, but they're kind of operationally solved in some way. So essentially what people do is they do the reduced form here, where the outcome, we measure the inequality of the outcome, and we try to assign it that part which is due to variations in circumstances associated, of course, with some sets of parameters, and then those parts which we think are driven by effort. There are good things about this. One is that whereas in the previous stuff, to measure stuff, we tend to rely just on the variance and the R squared. But with the equality of opportunity approach, you can take any inequality or poverty measure or whatnot to do this work. So what people think here is that all empirical approaches to do this tend to find a lower bound on the importance of circumstances, because circumstances are very hard to measure, and the more you have of them, the larger data sets you need to have. So you run into a dimensionality problem. So estimates tend to be lower bounds. I'm not going to go into the luck issue here, but there's something of that as well. Now, there are pros and cons to this. One is that this approach recognizes that you need multiple ways to understand circumstances to get a good handle on it. It's very flexible about the measure of inequality to use. So we tend to use lots of SES measures, and importantly, we also tend to include mothers in this. We can include grandparents, and we can kind of only the data set kind of, and an intelligent conversation about what counts as a circumstance limit us to here. But there are cons as well. One is that you can argue, my co-author and I differed in the degree in which we want to argue this, but all the same, you can argue that you really need to have a multivariate causal model in order to do this separation properly. Because the question is, if the omitted things that still affect the outcome, are they circumstances or do they capture effort? That's a hard question. And we also can't account for unobserved family background factors. That's, of course, correlated with the first one. And then it requires very rich and large samples in order to be done properly. But there are interesting things that have come out of this. The World Bank has invested a lot in doing these kinds of studies. And depending on, so in Brazil, for instance, from which we have several papers, about 25% to a third of the variance can be picked up by just a few different characteristics such as race, parental education, the region of where you live and father's occupation. In Sweden, where we've used a very much larger set of circumstances, we tend to capture a much smaller fraction of the variance in our studies, about 6%. We do capture about a quarter of the Gini coefficient, which is kind of interesting that the variance and some proper inequality measure can in fact capture quite different parts of these studies of the work. Andreas Peichel and his co-author find that of the mean log deviation, about 1/4 is captured by a reasonably limited subset of things. Andreas's work also is rare in that he does include gender as a circumstance. I've done some work in a paper which I'm not talking about here, but with some colleagues at SOFI, also looking at the gender dimension. And And it does turn out that if you combine men and women and include gender as a circumstance, it's the overwhelmingly most important individual circumstance you find. So it accounts for a tremendous amount of inequality across all persons. But then you can extend this. So Anders and I did for Sweden, we extended some work we had done with John Romer earlier, and we can just focus on the first column here. An overall Gini coefficient of about 0.26. And when we start sequentially including stuff, so if we only include parental income in two different functional forms, we account for between 19 and 23% of the Gini coefficient as circumstances. If we extend this by including parental occupation and education, this goes up to about 28% of the Gini coefficient. If we further include grandparental education, which is kind of the vogue in this stuff nowadays, we don't in fact get any additional leverage in the extent to which we can assign stuff to circumstances. Neither do we get any action from including birth order, which many people think is really important. But then including your own IQ and non-cognitive skills as measured by the armed forces tests at age 18, we get up to 2/5 of the Gini coefficient. Now, whether or not you want to include IQ and non-cognitive skills at age 18 in circumstances is hotly debated, but we're just kind of making this point to illustrate that by including more circumstances, you will account for more of inequality, but then you need to have a careful conversation about is it reasonable to think, are you responsible for your IQ at age 18 or not? I think that's an open issue. Now, we think that despite having a lot of promise, we still get lower explanatory power from this approach than you get from the sibling correlation. So the last column, which has the R squares, we're at 8% of the overall variance to begin with. Doing this same approach, the equivalent sibling correlation is still about 0.25 in Sweden. So we're at a substantially lower fraction of the overall importance of family background, but we are able to kind of quantify the importance of specific dimensions of it, abstracting from the issue of causality and interactions between these different circumstances. But then we get into a question of are factors that siblings share circumstances or not. So I'm going to skip to the summary. I will say that there are lots of circumstance variables that actually haven't been looked at very carefully, and I think the school and teacher quality ones are very interesting. There's of course a huge literature on how school and teacher quality affect the outcomes of children, but in this kind of intergenerational mobility circumstance view of things, that's figured less prominently, and I think that's an obvious way to go. And then there are kind of early childhood health factors and this and that which could be included as can. But all the same, I think that the promise of this approach is more to kind of show you where to find stuff that's important. It doesn't still give you as much as the sibling correlation does. So I'm going to, in fact, I'll try to quickly summarize. I think there's a paradox that the intergenerational mobility, the Galtonian regressions, are the most commonly used, the most widely discussed approaches to looking at intergenerational income mobility. But they don't address the inequality of opportunity issue, even if they largely motivated these studies by that. It does tell us something that's easy to understand and makes it into the public policy debate. But it does suggest that family background isn't particularly important. The intergenerational effect question, it has lots of strengths. It addresses really well-defined questions that are of both public policy and scientific importance. It tends to take mothers seriously, which the previous one doesn't. But the effects tend to be very small, and they suggest an even smaller role for family background in accounting for overall inequality. The sibling correlation doesn't really provide an answer to any well-defined public policy question or a scientific question, but we think it's a very useful omnibus measure because it does capture a very wide range of influences that people aren't responsible for, both observed and unobserved ones. But the key challenge here is to understand what is it in that omitted stuff that's important. Most efforts to find specific things about that have come up with not much. But of course, looking for the keys under the light is less useful than looking for it in the dark if you lost it in the dark. So I'm all in favor of looking for the keys where they are rather than where there's light. So I still think this is useful. I think the equality of opportunity approach is in principle a very useful result because it does highlight the importance of different circumstances, but the problem really is one of interpretation. How far away are we from a causal model, one where the importance of omitted variables is much less, and one where we don't need to spend a lot of time thinking about whether or not they're circumstances or if they capture effort? That would be nice. So I think a lot of work needs to be done there. And then there are problems of principle. So suppose, for instance, that there really is some well-defined effort variable which distinguishes between how well you do in life regardless of your circumstances. But now suppose that the effort is really one of parents instilling into you a high work ethic. Is that a circumstance or is it effort? And that's a difficult conceptual problem to which there's no really straightforward answer. And in particular, suppose these are correlated within families, across siblings and so on. So it's really hard to tell how to treat all of these things. But I do think that this also has a lot of promise. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
We have two discussants, and we'll start with Professor Miles Korak. Professor Korak is a professor of economics at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the
Microphone.
University of Ottawa. Please.
פשוט. יש לו מצגת?
Do I have to do something to start my slide? No.
רק לעמוד קרוב למיקרופון.
Yeah, I'm not making much effort.
Can you stand closer to the microphone, please?
Sure. Is this the microphone here?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm getting close. It's a PDF. Oh yeah. Control L.
Control L.
So I should say in the beginning, like many of you, I have been a consistent reader of Markus's work since he began researching in this area in the 1990s, I guess when he was 12 years old. And of course with Anders Björklund. But I'm going to use his paper more as a springboard to discuss, I think, the theme of this conference, or the subtext of this conference, which I gather is to promote and encourage research on social mobility and inequality. And I'm going to speak to the public policy maker in you who is concerned about public engagement on this issue in an evidence-based way. So what I'd like to take from his paper and some other work that I've done and others have done are, what are some policy relevant indicators that you would put into a dashboard to monitor social mobility in a country like Israel? And that dashboard has to be easy to understand, timely, and it also has to be movable by public policy. So that's sort of where I'll go with this. And we have some conundrums that Markus has pointed us to. First of all, I'm going to suggest as one of my major message is that theory leads us to a statistic, an important statistic called the intergenerational elasticity. And that statistic is of interest in its own right as a summary measure of mobility. That should be on every country's dashboard. It tells us the degree to which inequality is passed across generations. But it can't be the full story, because we're really interested in statistics like this because we have this notion of equality of opportunity in our minds. And as Markus so correctly suggested, that is not a measure of equality of opportunity. Also, it can't directly inform public policy in the sense, and perhaps I've overstated this in the slide, in the sense of giving you causal impacts of interventions. Nonetheless, I'm going to argue that this is a theoretically grounded, descriptive statistic that has public policy relevance, and every country should have one of these. Theory is also important because it leads us to this notion of equality of opportunity. We rely on John Romer's work, which is a response to John Rawls. But I'm going to take a different tact on this discussion than Markus, who's coming at it as a statistician. And I think he pointed to several conundrums, if that's the plural of the word conundrum. And at heart, I don't think there's a technical solution to that. I don't think getting more data solves that problem. At heart, the division between circumstance and effort is a value judgment. Just in the way that we make a value judgment when we draw a poverty line to distinguish those who are poor from not poor. That's really fundamentally an exercise in communication. There's nothing in social sciences that says welfare capabilities change fundamentally by crossing a threshold from 1 shekel below to 1 shekel above a particular line. So I'm going to push the equality of opportunity agenda, but I'm going to suggest that we need to make a value judgment here, and we can make different ones to respond to our public policy needs. But in Romer's framework, there are easy to implement statistics, visuals that can capture the public imagination in a way that I think can inform the discourse around inequality and equality of opportunity. So those are my major messages. I'm going to continue this with some practical suggestions. The cutting edge in research in intergenerational mobility moves according to a dance with different players. Sometimes the cutting edge moves when you dance with theory. Sometimes it moves because there's policy interest. But oftentimes the frontier moves because data gets better. And the cutting edge here, as Markus quite clearly illustrated to you with Swedish data, is the use of administrative data. And I think in the previous session, a commentator hinted at the importance of using tax-based data And maybe that is or is not feasible in Israel at this time, but that should be a margin that you work on to developing tax data or administrative data. And also, I think we'll see other papers in this conference that makes use of administrative data here that potentially captures the universe not a sample of the population. So use this administrative data to estimate this summary statistics, the intergenerational elasticity, and I'll tell others. I'll talk about others, like transition matrices. So as Markus alluded to, if you remember that very colorful graph he had, one corner popped up, all right? So there are potential non-linearities here that are important to understand. Policy also is concerned about direction, upward mobility, how to move people from a low income state to a higher income state. You don't get that sense of direction and non-linearities from the summary statistics of the elasticity. So we should also think of transition matrices or particular cells in the transition matrices as important indicators for our dashboard. There's something missing in all of this discussion, and it's this notion of absolute mobility. Growth is important. And the agenda now is around inclusive growth. We can't just use GDP or GDP per capita as a measure of welfare anymore. We should think about how the least advantaged benefit from growth. And so to frame this as inclusive growth, and for me, the real worry, I think, is inequality in the bottom half of the income distribution and the capacity of those born and raised in low income to move out of that state. So I would like to know what's an appropriate poverty line for the development of an intergenerational cycle of poverty. And where do the risks of that intergenerational cycle fall off as income grows? And so we have to bring in notions, I think, of absolute income. And sometimes growth is just important because it is a substitute for our worry about relativities. And so we become less concerned about how the pie is shared if we see progress in our own lives. And again, Markus sort of hinted at that, but didn't pick it up as much as I think is merited if we're going to develop this dashboard for policymakers. Part of the problem with this whole literature that he's speaking to are the very long lags. All right? So remember, ideally, we're talking about the outcomes of a group of people who in the here and now are 40 or 50 years of age in the prime of their earnings period, who were born in the 70s or the 60s, went to those primary schools. And the experiences that they've had in their life course isn't necessarily going to tell us about the cohort being born now and raised in there a higher inequality. And so that causal framework that Markus illustrated is important because we might want to step into a bunch of short-term indicators that we know are important indicate important transitions that children are making to a long-run earnings attainment. And so we might want to worry about test scores in primary school or transitions out of high schools. These will be the early markers in our dashboard, the early signals that something is awry or will be awry when 20 years down the road we get to estimate the next intergenerational elasticity. Okay? And I'm going to argue that we have some of that information in surveys like the PISA, which you know is conducted for a bunch of high school aged students. We probably need a PISA-like instrument for the earlier years when children are 4, 5, and 6. And then maybe in Israel you have all of these things and you can bring them all together in an important way. But of course there's always a data agenda here. So here's the famous equation that Markus attributed to Galton, and we understand this as a theory from the work of Becker and Tomes. And so beta, the intergenerational elasticity, relates some outcome in the parent's generation to the adult outcome in the child's generation, usually earnings. But this is also a prediction of adult incomes. Okay, if you take the anti-log of this and you sort of don't worry about geometric versus arithmetic means with a log normal distribution, this is going to be important. That is the income growth that all members of this cohort experience. That's a measure of absolute mobility. And beta is very important because raising the average income level of the parental cohort will then give you the extra kick that some less or more privileged people get over what the average is in the cohort. So I think both of those things have to come together. All right? They have to come together because, in some sense, we also want to focus on movement. And for me, I've taken this quintile transition matrix from a paper by Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren and others. That's now an extremely well-cited paper. But these kinds of transition matrices, in addition to the alpha and the beta I pointed to you, should be part of our dashboard. In particular, this cell. The chances that if you were born to a low-income parent in the bottom 20%, what are the chances you'll grow up to be adult in the bottom 20%? What really makes the difference between countries, intergenerational elasticities, is not what's happening in this part of the distribution. For the broad majority of people, there's a good deal of mobility. Maybe that's why there's angst. A middle-class family can just as easily see its children rise or fall in the income distribution, almost in the degree to which a random process would determine. What makes countries different in those summary measures are what's happening here, an intergenerational cycle of poverty, and what's happening here, an intergenerational cycle of privilege. So we need clear measures of that. And I would also argue that we would want an absolute cutoff here as well. Okay? So I have 1 minute to go through this. Let me make a statement then about John Romer's approach. And here's the value judgment. I mean, we're all signatories to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And Romer says it himself. For children, everything is a circumstance, nothing is effort. Okay? So up to the age of majority, which in most countries is 17, we treat everything as a circumstance. All right? Where I also differ with Markus is this should not be a causal exercise. It's a predictive exercise. Many of those things that are missing are interactions. And this is a machine learning problem just calling for a research agenda. Okay? As he pointed out, there's a curse of dimensionality here. We have big K, potentially, if we account for all of these interactions, and little n. And that's what machine learning is all about. And so I would begin to treat this as a prediction problem, not in a causal framework. And forget about the cut between circumstance and effort. For children, it's all circumstance. Can I predict, knowing everything I possibly can, by the time you are age 5, your earnings when you are 40? That, I think, says a lot. All right? Can I predict to the same degree or even more before the age of 18 what your earnings will be when you're 40? There are data sets that will let me do that. And if we treat it as a prediction problem, I think we'll make headway. So let me skip over my discussion of theory. And I just want to say, in terms of those sort of shorter term indicators that we need that are relevant for policy, that will give us the early warning lights in our dashboard, I'm hard pressed to imagine a program that's had more public policy impact than the PISA. And I think phrasing PISA through John Romer's framework, I think asks us to look at cumulative distribution functions, which we can easily map out. And I can give you an example here of PISA test scores, or PISA-like test scores for American children at a high school. And I can show you those test scores with these cumulative distribution functions arranged according to a particularly important circumstance, the mother's education level, that they fall exactly on top of each other. So I don't have time to explain these spaghettis, but maybe you can catch me at the break. But I think these can appear easily in a dashboard, can be easily explained and communicated to the public and engage debate. So theory leads us to statistic. We should take that theory seriously. That's the intergenerational elasticity. That should be in your dashboard. But it's linear, so you need something like transition matrices to capture the nonlinearities. And equality of opportunity is something we should take seriously. That's ultimately what we want to talk about. That's what is motivating our policy discussion. And I think Romer actually does give us some practical ways forward. And I very much appreciate, as I usually do, reading Markus's and Anders' paper, because it always stimulates more and more thought. Thanks very much.
Our second discussant is Professor Manuel Trachtenberg. Professor Trachtenberg is a member of Knesset, our parliament, and a professor of economics at Tel Aviv University. He has chaired the National Economic Council and the Planning and Budgeting Committee of the Council for Higher Education.
Hello to you all. I'm amazed that to see almost 100 people sitting quietly for 2 hours and listening to each other after coming from the Knesset, which is just a few hundred yards from here. It's almost a miracle that only in the Israeli Museum it can happen. Right. I forget, that such a thing can happen. I mean, so I thought that the best I can do in order to contribute significantly, perhaps, to the discussion here is to actually describe to you the frustrations of somebody in the trenches, in the policy trenches. And I hope that, by describing that, okay, it will maybe have some consequences for research in this field. But before that, I want to say that I think it was a high time to have this conference here in Israel. This is a key issue in Israel, more than now than ever before. And I can't remember when was the last time, if ever, that we had such a conference. So congratulations to the organizers. Secondly, I want to say to Markus that I greatly enjoyed the really going systematically through the distinction between the 4 concepts that you put forward, the intergenerational, the 2 forms, siblings, and equality of opportunity. It's incredibly important, when we think about these issues, to make these distinctions, realize how much can we learn from each of these measures, and then realize also that there are limits to the distinctions we make between circumstances and effort and so forth, and pop up the value judgment in that. So these things are of great value, and I really very thankful to you for having done this. Now I said, what I want to do is to describe to you the frustrations. I take seriously the economic research for policy. I think that that's perhaps my only relative comparative advantage. Everything else in the trenches, when you come from academia, you are endowed with the wrong attributes. And I've been involved in many economic policy issues, fiscal policies, etc. And I must confess that the gap between what economic research has to offer and the true needs for policy formulation is the largest, in my experience, in this field, as opposed to fiscal policy, R&D policy, transportation policy, etc. And that's amazing, because in my view, this is the most important, period, in the end. And so, there is a real problem here. I was lucky enough to study under Tzvi Grilkes at Harvard, 35 years ago or so. And I remember he teaching, the siblings, papers, and so forth. And with all due respect, I want to ask you, 2017, are we much wiser in that respect that we were 40 years ago? I'm not sure. in terms of policy. I'm saying in terms of being able to get up in the morning, go to, to the Knesset and put on the table a policy outline that will be based on research. I'm afraid we haven't made much progress in that respect. Now, the question I want you to focus, if you could, is the following. Suppose that tomorrow morning I put on the table $1 billion US, okay, in the Israeli budget, okay, for the next 2 years. This is not a theoretical question. For the purposes, generally speaking, okay, of improving equality of opportunity, vaguely phrased, okay, trying to reduce inequality, vaguely phrased, and I have a political consensus that that's the right place to put the $1 billion US. The Israelis sitting here understand that this is not a theoretical question because $1 billion have been put on the table very recently. Okay? Where should I put them? Given what we saw now. What are the interventions that are most conducive given a budget constraint? Okay, we don't have the luxury of imagining an unboundless budget where I can, try to attack every single control that you have there in the regressions, okay, and therefore, you bet that even if the R square is 0.4, okay, you are doing something. No, I don't have that luxury, and I won't have it. So what should I do? So let me give you a couple of examples of actual questions I'm facing. I'm very, very active in trying to affect policy in early childhood education. I strongly believe that when we talk about equality of opportunity, when we talk about circumstances early on, that's the place to go. Am I sure of that? By no means. You mentioned PISA results. Okay, the PISA results are a snapshot at a certain age. Okay, it's very convenient for politicians, extremely convenient for education ministers to try to affect that statistic. Okay, they will be very willing to invest 200, 300 million shekels in 2 years to show progress in the PISA results. Are we better off as a consequence of that? I'm pretty sure that we are not. So sometimes the PISA results, which are very important indeed, as you mentioned, can turn around you because it's something that you can affect, okay, but without really changing equality of opportunity and so forth. Okay, same thing with matriculation exams in Israel. Big issue. How many of our youngsters take the highest level of math in graduation, in matriculation exams? Are we really changing something in the dimensions we're interested in? I'm not sure. So that's something that has to be of a major concern. Can we do otherwise, even in research? Yes. I want to give you an example. If there is one field in economics that has changed dramatically in the past decade, in this respect, is development economics. Okay, economics of development. There is an enormous literature with all sorts of interventions and random assigned groups and etc. All the controls that MIT is a focus of that with Duflo and so forth. That at least try to bring some data, microdata, okay, of experiments that may tell us about the effectiveness of different tools, okay, of different policy instruments, of different budgetary assignments, okay. So it can be done. We can take this very seriously. How would I go about it? And this is I think we have very little time, so just to, this is kind of something I would like to do, okay. You should ask from the policymakers a list, okay, a laundry list, if you wish, of types of policies that you may be thinking of implementing for the general purpose of improving equality of opportunity. Okay, vaguely phrased. I can get into a discussion of that, but there's no time. By the way, I prefer to phrase it different. I prefer to phrase it as an objective, to say that we should make sure that we can enable each individual to realize his or her potential, okay, at the starting point, okay? And we can elaborate on that, there is no time now. So we should come up with a list from the policymakers, okay? So, and you can categorize it by segmenting life, okay, infant, school age, etc. Here I give you 2, 3 in each segment types of policies with a price tag, okay, to each of them, okay? And then I tell you, okay, let's try to make sense of this in terms of producing research that will be tailored from the beginning. It will be formulated, the research will be formulated in order to try to contrast effectiveness for a given budget of different types of policies. Not the way we typically do research in economics, which is we start from a research question that is interesting to us, and then at the end we say, well, there may be some policy implications. Okay? No, start the other way around. Okay? That, I think, is crucial, and it's very much needed in order, in the end, to narrow the gap between the two, between research and policy. And the last comment. The Israeli society, I think, it could be an amazing real-life laboratory of what do we mean by circumstances and background. Why is that? Because we are an extremely segmented society along very different dimensions. The president of Israel calls this, we are a society made of tribes, okay? We started that way with 12 tribes. Now he has reduced it to 4. I'm not sure if that's true. I mean, there are more tribes going around here, and they are very well defined along critical parameters in this field, actually, okay? So the fact that you have a modern, thriving, growing economy superimposed on a tribal society can be an amazing laboratory to exercise, to do these exercises in controlling for a bunch of backgrounds. So this is it. I would, believe me that I will pay part of my salary to be able to, at least twice a month, to be speaking in front of an audience like this, but we make our own choices. That's effort, not circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. We have a very short time for comments and questions because the lunch is waiting for us. So, please.
Is there a microphone? Yes. So the minister's clearly stolen the show. Is it on? Yeah? Yeah, okay. So just to respond, there's a bigger issue here about the incentives that economists have. So some of your $1 or $1 billion should be orientated to sort of reconfiguring the incentives in academic research to drive that kind of agenda you speak. Because the incentives, I think we all know for a long time, have been skewed in a very different way. And I just wanted to comment on your very perceptive point about the PISA results. So we do need a certain amount of caution when we put indicators out there. Then politically, we might just sort of game the system because that's what we can measure. But to be clear, what I was trying to do in my presentation was line up a new PISA for the early years where we know that that's where the focus should be. And I was trying to say, look what PISA for the high school years has done to policy debate. Developing those incentives and that data infrastructure should be part of your billion-dollar budget thinking.
Thank you. Yossi, please.
בסדר, לא נורא. עכשיו חזר.
First of all, I want to make a comment about the first paper by Chaya, my old high school mate, and Miri, and mostly to the discussion. In Israel, and this is really peculiar about Israel, 24 is the age that you don't only enter the labor market, you enter even the stage of higher education. This is the average age of entering higher education. It's the 3 years of service, it's sometimes the additional year of traveling abroad, sometimes an additional year of military courses and stuff like that. So that's why the curves that were presented reflect two combined effects. One is the effect of higher education, and the other is the effect of age and experience or mobility once you're already in the labor market. And I think that if we can split these two effects, it would contribute a lot to our understanding of mobility. Because part of it, in a sense, the educational part is part of intergenerational mobility, because we usually finance our education, even high education, by help of the parents. I can just tell an anecdote. I'm now sitting in a committee that has to define on the rules of university support to the poorest students. And before that, we bounded it at the age of 27. Now we raised the boundary. There's no boundary anymore, because even older students need to get help from their parents. That's one comment. The second comment has to do with the theoretical background of our mobility and inequality research. I have all the respect for John Romer, but I think that the theoretical background has long been expanded, and it's not only normative to a large extent, but also positive in the old traditional way. I mean, in the last 20 years, income inequality, income distribution, and mobility has become important macroeconomic variables. They are studied per se, the same way we study the rate of growth, the same way we study unemployment, the same way we study other important macroeconomic variables. They are important. There's a lot of studies that justify it, but we don't need to justify it any longer. It's a common thing, and we should just treat it as it. Last comment to Manuel. I'm very afraid of policymakers giving us issues to study. I mean, I prefer that we would do studies for studies per se, to understand the world we live in. And if some of these things can evolve and help policymakers, even better. But it's a bit touchy in a sense, because we already see that a lot of times our research is biased by policymakers. And I can give the simplest example. The amount of studies done by economists on monetary policy are completely without any proportion to its importance, to its effect on the economy. It's simply because central banks are financing a lot of studies. And it's a shame, basically.
Thank you. Markus, Lizana. Shortly, please.
Yes. We saw that, in fact, social mobility in the middle is relatively high, and you all pointed to the fact that we have two interesting data. Social mobility at the bottom is low, and social mobility at the top is very, very low, and this was your blue pixel in your presentation. And I think that when we are looking so much at data on IGE, on intergenerational elasticity, the problem is that then we don't focus on that. We focus on everything, but not on really what is the main problem. And when Professor Trachtenberg spoke, and he was in fact thinking on intergeneration, he was thinking on social mobility at the bottom and the kindergarten. And I agree with you that this is very important. But there are papers now speaking about social mobility at the top. And they have shown that it is because universities have exactly the same problem that kindergarten. You have elite universities and not elite universities. And when you do policy of putting the money at the top, then you are even increasing social immobility. So I agree that we have to try to take this kind of research on social mobility and to focus on really the two main problems, social mobility at the top, social mobility at the bottom, and they will both be about education and the fact that when we look at education, we look at very homogeneous education. Well, it's not true. You have two different types of school. Universities at the top and regular universities, high schools and kindergarten, very high level, and low and the medium level. And politicians here and research could go exactly together and mix their ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.